biography remembers the life of Elizabeth Taylor. She was one of the most beloved actresses of her generation.
She was magnificent from the beginning.
A timeless beauty.
She was so beautiful, you just didn't believe anybody could be that beautiful.
A true humanitarian.
She fought and fought and fought and raised hundreds of millions of dollars for AIDS over the years.
And an American icon.
She's one of the great film stars of all time.
I stand here tonight for every person who ever admired Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor has given us her extravagant beauty, her powerful determination, and her amazing grace.
Elizabeth Taylor, actress, activist,
I'm here to help fight AIDS.
mother, businesswoman, celebrity. Half a century after she first became a star, her every move still seizes headlines, often pushing Hollywood's hottest faces off the covers of magazines and tabloids.
She's the most long-lasting star in the firmament. And of course I know about that cosmic stuff.
Her name can sell a product.
Fashion, I see, is catching.
Her appearances are an event. But Taylor's public image hasn't always told the private story of a down-to-earth survivor who battled near-fatal illness and devastating tragedies with strength and humanity.
So when all is said and done, it is not her violet eyes that are her best feature, it is her heart.
Elizabeth Roseman Taylor's life was charged with drama from the day of her birth in a suburb of London on February 27, 1932.
It wasn't an easy birth. For 10 days, Elizabeth didn't open her eyes. And then suddenly snapped them open, and the mother saw what was to be one of Elizabeth's great, beautiful features, her violet eyes.
Although born in Britain, Elizabeth and her older brother Howard were the children of American Midwesterners who left the U.S. for the excitement of London. Francis Taylor ran a successful art gallery. His wife Sarah was an ex-stage actress whose moment of celebrity in the Broadway play The Fool left her addicted to the adrenaline rush of drama. It was a passion she encouraged in her daughter during Elizabeth's carefree English childhood.
It was an idyllic childhood. It was like being in the country, although you were in the heart of London. And then we had a country home. I had chickens, and I had my pony. I loved anything that walked, crawled.
Elizabeth adored animals. She relished their spontaneous, unconditional love, and her strong will found an exciting challenge in horse riding.
I rode bareback. That was my favorite. And I was thrown off my horse, my pony, into a patch of stinging nettles. Man, did that smart.
And she got right back on the pony again, which is a self-portrait of Elizabeth Taylor.
Despite Elizabeth's rough and tumble attitude, her ambitious mother was determined to mold her into a refined young lady. Sarah guided her daughter through deportment classes and dance lessons, confident that someday Elizabeth would marry a titled husband.
Her mother was very conscious of class, of socially aspiring, getting from one class to another, particularly for Elizabeth.
But Sarah's plan was shattered in 1939 as air raid sirens across England signaled the approach of war. That spring, Elizabeth and her family bid tearful farewells to her birthplace, and during their return to America, Sarah shaped a new vision of her daughter's future.
My father's a captain, Captain Crew. I'm Sarah.
Aboard ship, mother and daughter saw their first film together,
My daddy is a good soldier.
The Little Princess, starring Shirley Temple.
Isn't he the most wonderful man in all the world?
Sarah Taylor, who'd never forgotten her own ambitions as an actress, was excited by a new plan of how to make her daughter a success.
Sarah began to replace the idea of making a good marriage for Elizabeth in English society with the hope of getting a good job for Elizabeth in the film industry. Elizabeth always obeyed her mother. Her mother wanted to... Therefore, Elizabeth said, "I will be an actress."
The 7-year-old was dazzled by the contrast between war-torn Britain and sunny Beverly Hills, where Taylor's father launched another successful art gallery. Sarah met gossip queen Hedda Hopper, and by 1940, the chairman of Universal Pictures, Cheever Cowden, who saw screen promise in Elizabeth's unusual beauty. Cowden gave the 9-year-old a 1-year contract at $100 a week, and in 1942, Universal cast Elizabeth in a small role in the low-budget comedy There's One Born Every Minute, opposite Carl Alfalfa Switzer.
I'm gonna sing a campaign song entitled Lemuel P. Twine for Mayor, and written by yourself, stupid.
Gloria Ann.
And dedicated to the
Dedicated, darling.
Yes, Mother. Dedicated to the ladies of the Pawhuskett County Hysterical Society. Historical. You voters, you can't lose. Take some care with the man you choose. Twine for mayor. He's only there for us.
Although Elizabeth showed spunk and charm, the studio saw only limited potential, and Universal dropped her contract. But the family's disappointment turned to hope weeks later, when Elizabeth's father met producer Sam Marks. Marks was hunting for a child actress to appear in the film Lassie Come Home. It was already shooting at the most successful and mythic movie studio of the day, MGM.
I did a test after hours, and I had to do my first acting with a mop that was supposed to be Lassie.
Elizabeth won the part at the salary of $100 a week, $150 less than her canine co-star.
The boy's family was poor. So poor they had to sell Lassie, and she was shipped hundreds of miles away. Then one day she ran away. She was going home.
Lassie Come Home featured a sensitive teenager who'd also escaped war-torn Britain, Roddy McDowell. He became one of Elizabeth's dearest friends.
Elizabeth had a happy time at the studio because Roddy was wonderful. They were about the same age, and he was sort of like another brother to Elizabeth, and someone always to confide in and tell her problems to.
I hope you won't worry too much about Lassie. I'll take care of her. Really, I will. I'll take care of her for you. So you won't have to worry any at all.
Come along, Joe, lad.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Poor Lassie. Poor Lassie. Poor girl.
Taylor's stunning looks and instinctive acting gifts also caught the eye of MGM chief, the most powerful and feared executive in Hollywood. In 1943, Mayer put the 11-year-old under a 7-year contract, and overnight, MGM became Elizabeth's school, her workplace, and her one source of contact with children her age.
Here was a little girl who was very nice and not at all pretentious. She wasn't snooty, or she would jump rope with me and play with me.
She always came on the set with 2 or 3 dogs or a squirrel in a cage that they had to put off the set because it was making noise all the time.
Helen, where does that road go? I told you before, to Bradford. But after Bradford, Derby, I suppose, Nottingham, and then London.
Elizabeth's compassionate nature was put to good use when MGM loaned her to 20th Century Fox for its forthcoming adaptation of Jane Eyre. Taylor was cast as Helen, an abused and dying orphan who becomes the title character's closest friend.
Helen? Oh, I'm so glad. I heard Dr. Rivers say. I was afraid. I'm not afraid, Jane. Helen? You must be cold. Lie down and cover yourself up. Are you warm now? Yes. Good night, Jane. Good night, Helen.
Fox didn't even give Elizabeth Taylor billing in Jane Eyre, but if you look at any scene she appears in, you want to look at nothing else, just her face.
But if acclaim eluded the 11-year-old contract player, her fortunes were about to change, thanks to a film that seemed to Elizabeth literally tailor-made to her talents.
National Velvet, a great story. As a highly successful Book of the Month Club selection, this fine, spirited drama, with its very unusual title, thrilled thousands of readers.
By 1943, Elizabeth Taylor was determined to capture the most coveted part for a young actress at MGM, the starring role in National Velvet. Her affinity for animals, especially horses, made her identify strongly with the character of Velvet Brown, a British teen who disguises herself as a boy to win the Grand National Steeplechase.
30 jumps, the hardest course in the world. The National, the greatest race on earth.
At first, MGM thought the 11-year-old was too young, but the insistent actress embarked on a round-the-clock campaign until the studio said yes.
Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer now presents this most human story of a boy, a girl, and a horse in all the warm tenderness of its modest, unpretentious sincerity.
I'd sooner have that horse happy than go to heaven.
She was magnificent from the beginning. I remember all the scenes with her. They were great. She was marvelous in them, and she would. It would only take us 1 or 2 takes.
Mart's like riding a fairy horse. Who knows what you want before you know yourself? When he takes a jump, he kind of gives a second hitch and tucks his feet up under him, so he's only a body without legs. You just have to sit on him. Wait till you see.
I see that the horse is tired and his coat's shiny from sweat and he needs water. You probably had him over 6 counties since morning. Your pa wants you home for lunch.
Watch.
Doing National Velvet was my life.
Velvet, no!
I chose the horse, which was in real life, a total renegade. And I tamed him, and at the end of the film, because nobody else could ride him.
Elizabeth was even unfazed when she fell from the horse and suffered a spinal injury. Taylor tried her best to ignore the painful accident. Sarah influenced her daughter's work by standing off camera and giving Elizabeth hand signals to guide her performance.
Elizabeth as a child had always been very obedient to her mother, and she carried over that sort of peremptory obedience into her role in the film. She showed all the obsessiveness, all the hysteria of someone who has to win the race in order to please her mother.
Were we the best in the world, Mother?
Yes, dear. The best in the world.
Released in 1944, National Velvet was a blockbuster, and America fell in love with its radiant star.
She made little girls confident. When little girls looked at her, they saw the possibility of having a grown-up command of life, looking like you can really win.
Louis B. Mayer put the full force of MGM's publicity machine into grooming Elizabeth for stardom. He tripled her salary to $300 a week and had her shuttled non-stop from photo shoots to interviews. The 13-year-old even became a popular young author with a book she co-wrote about her favorite chipmunk, Nibbles.
She was chaperoned, she was led around, instructed, told how to be, scrutinized. She always had to be on her best behavior.
The attention can get pretty oppressive. When you live in such a fishbowl, there is great pressure.
Still closely monitored by her parents and MGM, the pampered young actress was insulated from most children her age.
She never had a real growing up. She never was invited to a basketball game. She never went to a football game. She never had any socializing experience. And she just simply felt alone. She was alone and lost most of her childhood.
I was dominated by my family. Then when the studio started trying to do the same thing, I rebelled.
Taylor even defied Louis B. Mayer, when her mother confronted MGM's imposing chief to cast Elizabeth in better roles.
He said, "Are you trying to teach me how to run my effing studio?" And foam started forming around the edges of his mouth. And he used words, I promise you, up until then, I had never heard. It's since become one of my favorite parts of my vocabulary. I said, "Mr. Mayor, unless you apologize to my mother right now, I am leaving your office and I am never going to come back in, because I would love to go to school, to proms, to basketball games, football games. I don't give a damn whether I ever act another day in my life." And I learned a rather cynical lesson, because I didn't get fired the next day. And I realized that I must have some kind of intrinsic monetary value to them. Otherwise, I would have been out on my fanny.
The backlot beauty asserted herself in other ways. The 14-year-old shapely figure matched her stunning features. She loved wearing makeup, jewelry, and waist-cinching dresses to accentuate her allure.
At first, I found it very hard to accept compliments, and I didn't believe them. And my mother taught me from the very beginning, it isn't what you look like on the outside, it's what comes out of you that determines whether you're pretty or not.
Taylor's charms were put to good use in the 1947 comedy Life with Father. It co-starred William Powell, Irene Dunn, and Jimmy Lydon.
Do you ever play duets?
Well, I haven't up to now.
Neither have I. Up to now.
She was just about to be a full-blown woman at that age, and she was so beautiful. You just didn't believe anybody could be that beautiful. Everything was there.
I was hoping we could have a few minutes together before you left.
You can't see it when you're playing the scene with her, but it's there on the screen, that marvelous technique of hands, eyes, voice, movement. There's an aura there.
I'll show you how much I like you.
Get up, get up! Oh, Mary, don't do that. Please don't do that.
Niles, you're just a bold and forward girl.
Oh, no, it's not that.
Was it because it's Sunday?
No, it'd be the same any day. Oh, Mary.
Elizabeth's sexy new image made her an even more exploitable commodity as MGM rushed her into a slate of teen romances. In Little Women, Taylor once again played a flirtatious boy magnet alongside June Allison, Margaret O'Brien, and Janet Leigh.
The character was similar to Elizabeth in that she was headstrong and free-spirited and had this kind of air about her.
You're going to have a lovely nose someday, Amy.
Yes, I know. The only thing that made me a little sad during Little Women was Elizabeth was growing up and she didn't bring the chipmunks to the lot anymore.
Elizabeth's personality at this point was really confined to the parts that she played and obedience to her mother. And naturally, she began to find ways of escaping from her mother and father.
The 17-year-old formed a plan for independence, marriage. Elizabeth began to date, and her maternal nature made her eager to start a family.
She was raised in an extremely moral family. You did not have a relationship without marriage.
Those yearnings increased when she was loaned to Paramount to star in a big-budget romantic drama, A Place in the Sun, directed by George Stevens.
This is the unforgettable story of a boy from nowhere, fighting desperately for his place in the sun.
The part of Angela Vickers in that film was really the American dream. Elizabeth was the perfect embodiment of that.
Montgomery Clift, dazzled by the radiant beauty of Elizabeth Taylor, a girl so far above him she seemed like a goddess, but only too human when he held her in his arms.
We'll think of something somehow, whatever way we can. We'll have such wonderful times together, just the two of us.
Co-star Montgomery Clift was one of Hollywood's hottest actors, but he was emotionally tortured, and like Elizabeth, contemptuous of Hollywood phoniness. The two bonded instantly.
Elizabeth's heart always went out to people who were vulnerable in some way. Montgomery Clift was a rather insecure young man. He was gay. And Elizabeth's relations with him were very much those that she showed in the part she played in the film. She was maternal, she was loving, she took charge of Montgomery Clift.
I was agog. This genius young actor. And for the first time, I took acting seriously and realized it wasn't a game. It was a craft.
There's a startling moment in the film where you see them fall in love, and she says to him, "Come to Mama." You know, and the idea of a 17-year-old girl saying that and it being so true was really, I think, one of the remarkable moments in film.
A Place in the Sun would transform Taylor's image from a teenage star to that of a desirable woman. But Elizabeth's unrequited crush on Montgomery Clift left her aching even more for a deep connection with a man who would carry her into the world of adulthood and sexuality. As her 18th birthday approached, Elizabeth Taylor was ready to live the life of an adult, away from her parents and the ever-watchful MGM brass.
Elizabeth was a born romantic. She was the kind of girl who would look out of the castle window and wonder when her prince would come riding over the hills.
And along came Nicky Hilton, who was raised somewhat the same way. I mean, he grew up in that Hilton family with a powerful father, and I suspect like two lost souls.
23-year-old Conrad Hilton Jr. was the high-living heir to his father's hotel empire. To Elizabeth, he was Prince Charming, and she ignored friends' warnings about Hilton's rumored temper and womanizing. Taylor's fantasies were also fueled by the MGM comedy Father of the Bride. Elizabeth was cast as the soon-to-wed daughter of a put-upon patriarch played by Spencer Tracy. The actress's movie wedding heightened her real-life ambitions, and in 1950, Elizabeth said yes when Nicky Hilton proposed after 4 months of dating.
I think the marriage was like diving into the pool of... It kind of opened the door.
Wedding bells for the most beautiful teenager in the world. Excited fans see 18-year-old Elizabeth Taylor arrive at the Beverly Hills Church of the Good Shepherd to marry Conrad Hilton Jr., heir to a fabulous hotel empire.
It was perhaps the most sumptuous wedding that has ever been staged in Hollywood. Every star under the sun was invited.
Everybody was there, Clark Gable, Lana Turner, Spencer Tracy. I was thrilled to have been invited, and she just looked so beautiful. I never saw such a beautiful bride. It was, she was just breathtaking.
In New York, another bride and groom on a pretty extended honeymoon. Conrad Hilton Jr. and Elizabeth Taylor sail on the Queen Mary for 3 months in Europe.
But Elizabeth's fairy tale wedding quickly twisted into her worst nightmare. As their honeymoon began, Hilton grew bored with his sexually inexperienced bride. Within days, he deserted her for gambling casinos.
Nick Hilton was brutal. He drank a lot, he had a bad temper. In fact, Elizabeth later said that he used physical force on her.
The 18-year-old was too ashamed and embarrassed to share her misery with anyone. Her unhappiness grew when she was pushed by MGM to play an expectant newlywed in Father's Little Dividend, a sequel to Father of the Bride.
It's this young doctor of hers. I've always said she should have gone to our family doctor.
We wanted her to go to our doctor, too.
There's nothing the matter with my doctor. He's fine. He's wonderful. He told me not to pay any attention to... Nobody seems to realize this is my baby. Mine and Buckley's. You seem to think, well, the way you talk... Well, I'll have you know this. I'm going to have my baby the way I want to. Forever.
By the time production finished, Taylor's marriage was over. The shattered 18-year-old filed for divorce 6 months after her wedding.
She was in despair. She had tremendous self-doubts. You can imagine how she felt that here she had made this plunge into adulthood and it had turned into nothing but pain. And she was lost, felt lost.
That summer, MGM shipped its rising star off to England to appear in the medieval epic Ivanhoe. But more exciting for Elizabeth than the film was another actor who was making a name for himself in Britain, 38-year-old Michael Wilding. Taylor was charmed by Wilding's sophistication and wit, especially after the crude violence of Nicky Hilton.
He was incredibly nice. I mean, he was kind. When people say to me, what is charm? I say, go and watch Michael Wilding in a film. That's charm.
The debonair actor was twice Taylor's age, but Elizabeth pursued Wilding with a passion that amused the laid-back Englishman.
It was an amazing capacity she had. She was so lovely, so interesting, so compassionate, as though each man that she talked to was the only person on the planet.
Elizabeth was ready to remarry and encouraged Wilding to propose. That February, the couple wed in London in a ceremony that once again became a media event. Elizabeth was rediscovering her self-confidence, and Wilding was happy to let his movie star wife take charge of their future. Taylor now earned nearly $5,000 a week. She convinced MGM to also put Michael under contract. And in January 1953, the 20-year-old achieved a lifelong dream when she became the mother of Michael Wilding Jr.
Elizabeth always loved children. I mean, she was very good with children. And so I don't believe it changed her, but it broadened her.
She's a very down-to-earth. Really, if ever the term Mother Earth should apply to anyone, it would be to her. Strange, because she is so glamorous. And on the other side of the polarity, a kind of caretaking housewife. She wouldn't get all dressed up. She likes to just slob around.
Elizabeth finally felt like an adult, but her newfound stability was about to be shaken by a man who was unlike any she had ever met before. By 1955, Elizabeth Taylor could celebrate both a busy film career and the birth of her second son, Christopher. That year, Taylor also grabbed the chance to re-team with her Place in the Sun director, George Stevens. The film was Giant, Edna Ferber's sprawling tale of Texas.
This is Texas, mighty colossus of the Southwest, the land where today's ranch hand can become tomorrow's multimillionaire.
At first, Stevens doubted Taylor had the talent to play a strong-willed rancher's wife who ages 25 years in the story.
Elizabeth's beauty kind of put a burden on her. It was hard for many people to accept really how good an actress she was.
I'm a completely instinctive actress. I've never had any lessons. I try and become the character.
Come on, partner. Why don't you kick off your spurs?
Co-star Rock Hudson first recommended Elizabeth for the film. She never forgot it. On location in Texas, the two formed a close friendship.
Rock Hudson as Bick Benedict, big enough to stand up and take what he wanted. Elizabeth Taylor as Leslie Linton. Whether you loved her in the open or hid it inside you, you hungered.
Once again, Taylor kept the confidences she shared with a star whose homosexuality stayed carefully in the closet. Her maternal nature also won over her often defensive co-star, James Dean.
Say, you got any good-looking sisters back there? Might be interested in some poor people.
Money isn't old, you know, Jim.
Not when you got it.
But Taylor and Dean's friendship was brief. On September 30th, 1955, Taylor was watching dailies of Giant when she heard devastating news. James Dean was dead, the victim of a car crash.
Elizabeth was obviously distraught at Jimmy's death, and for 2 days she was unable to come into work, and it was a very tense situation.
Giant became a box office blockbuster. Elizabeth had triumphed in her most challenging acting role to date. But after 4 years of marriage, the actress found it harder to play the part of a happy wife to Michael Wilding.
She became a big star, and Michael Wilding didn't.
How do you do? Awfully good to see you. How do you do, sir? Good to see you.
And I think that Michael Wilding began to bend his elbow a great deal while she was working, and she'd come home at night and find him in his cups and everything else, and that fell apart.
Elizabeth confided her troubles to her close friend Montgomery Clift, who co-starred with Taylor in MGM's Civil War romance, Raintree County.
Elizabeth Taylor achieves new maturity and power as a dramatic actress in the tempestuous role of Susanna, who could not down the secret in her past.
What can I do?
But Clift was fighting his own demons. During production, the actor left Taylor's home after a party, groggy from mixing barbiturates and wine. Moments later, Elizabeth heard a horrifying crash. Clift had driven off a canyon. His face was shattered. He could barely breathe.
Elizabeth ran down the road, got into the car with him, nursed him in her lap until the ambulance arrived, warded off all the paparazzi photographers who quickly assembled, threatened them that if they took a picture of Montgomery Clift, they would never work again. She gave her heart out to people with flaws or people who had wounds. It brought out the best in Elizabeth.
Clift survived, and months later, Raintree County earned Elizabeth her first Academy Award nomination. But by 1956, as Michael Wilding cavorted with other women, Taylor was forced to acknowledge that her marriage was falling apart. Enter Mike Todd. Charismatic producer, fast-talking hustler, 49-year-old Todd was the toast of Hollywood with his star-studded smash, Around the World in 80 Days. Todd lived big and dreamed bigger. From their first meetings, Elizabeth was spellbound by the showman's bulldog ferociousness and blunt sexuality.
He walked up to her and said, "I'm in love with you, I'm going to marry you, that's all there is to it." She was mesmerized by Todd. She fell in love with him too. He was so flamboyant and his humor would match hers. Very bawdy, very bombastic, very funny. I considered them an ideal pair because they were equal in force of nature. I remember sitting in his office. He was courting her on the telephone. She was on the other end, and I could hear her demanding, cajoling, seducing, that if he wanted her, it would take a diamond and emerald pin. And I watched him melt. I watched him basically in his mind make out the check.
Unlike Michael Wilding and Nikki Hilton, Todd wasn't threatened by Taylor's salty independence or her power to hold the media spotlight. And in February 1957, 2 days after divorcing Michael Wilding, 25-year-old Elizabeth became Mrs. Mike Todd. The couple's good friends, singer Eddie Fisher and his movie star wife Debbie Reynolds, served as best man and matron of honor.
She relaxed with Mike because he just laid the world out for her. He was, powerful and dynamic, and I think Elizabeth really needed that.
Mike Todd was a gambler, and he taught Elizabeth to take these risks, the gambling risks. He was also a big spender. He believed that you attracted attention by spending your money conspicuously.
Elizabeth loved Todd's extravagant gifts, which included paintings, furs, and dazzling diamonds.
Mike, there's been a lot of publicity about your public spat. I even heard something about a champagne bottle incident. Please tell me
That
not
is
to
the most filthy thing I've ever heard in my life. I usually don't get cross. But the person that wrote this story is a frustrated old biddy who takes her frustrations out on her typewriter, and to me it is such a sad commentary. And if anybody believes it, that's even sadder. I wish everybody could be as unhappy as we are. Then there'd be no wars, there'd be no problems. The world would be quite nice.
They had kind of artful, combustible fights, and they loved it. They were real good at it.
Well, we're not introverts. If we have something to say, I say, hey, Liz. She hollers, hey, Mike. And if you make a Dreyfus case out of that, then it's too bad.
And then they would make up.
And it always ends up in lovemaking.
It doesn't matter. I don't really
we don't
care
like
what
to even-
anybody thinks anyway, because we know. And we'll know
Well,
20 years from now, 30 years from now, if we're still alive.
With the birth of her third child, Liza, in 1957, Elizabeth Taylor's world seemed complete. She was being paid a then astounding salary of $125,000 per picture, and her happiness with Mike Todd was clear to anyone who saw the pair together.
Shall I really answer? Well, I think he's the nicest person I've ever lived with. No, he's a wonderful man. He has everything that you could possibly want. He has a wonderful sense of humor. I don't want him to hear this
No.
because his head is big enough as it is.
Yes, it is.
And he's very generous, and he's very sympathetic. But I think the most wonderful thing of all is that he's a marvelous cook. So that saves me from the kitchen.
In 1958, Taylor eagerly started work on the adaptation of Tennessee Williams' sizzling play, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, opposite Paul Newman. 2 weeks into filming, Mike Todd asked Elizabeth to fly with him for the weekend to New York, but his wife was fighting pneumonia and stayed behind. On March 22nd, Todd kissed Elizabeth goodbye and boarded his private plane, the Liz. The next morning, Taylor awoke to the worst day of her life. Todd's plane had plummeted into the mountains over New Mexico. His remains were burned beyond recognition.
Her secretary and a very close friend walked into the room, and she knew what had happened, that he was dead. And she screamed, and she was just devastated, devastated.
I heard it on the radio and went right over, and she was in bed, disbelieving, upset with God. She was destroyed. Couldn't move, couldn't get out of bed.
Friends kept round-the-clock suicide watches on Elizabeth. But although Taylor was paralyzed by despair, she dragged herself back to MGM 3 weeks later to finish Cat on a Hot Tin Roof.
She felt Mike Todd would want her to complete that film. Another reason which became evident was that she needed the money. Despite the enormous spending power of Mike Todd, he had very little savings.
I feel all the time like a cat on a hot tin roof.
Then jump off the roof, Maggie, jump off it.
Elizabeth Taylor is Maggie the cat, a girl too hungry for love to care how she goes about getting it.
I don't mind making a fool of myself over you.
Well, I mind. I feel embarrassed for you.
Feel embarrassed. But I can't live on this way.
Now, you agreed to accept that condition.
I know I did, but I can't.
Taylor's scorching performance earned the actress her second Oscar nomination. But Elizabeth was inconsolable, and the world mourned for the beautiful widow who had lost the love of her life.
Love? That was Mike's legacy to me. To accept it with all my heart and graciousness, and to return it in kind, unconditionally. And I hope that's what I pass on to the ones I love.
As Taylor clung to Mike's memory, she found consolation in the company of Todd's best friend, recording star Eddie Fisher, husband of Debbie Reynolds and the father of 2 young children.
She was living with the ghost of Mike Todd. And the closest thing to him that she could find to keep that ghost alive was Eddie Fisher.
Suddenly, friendship turned to passion, and Hollywood's rumor mill exploded when reporters caught Taylor and Fisher spending a weekend together in New York. Most stars would have cloaked the romance in deception, but Elizabeth refused to live a lie.
Hedda Hopper reproached Elizabeth. She was then the leading gossip columnist in Hollywood. And Elizabeth's reply was brutal and frank. She said, "Mike is dead and I am alive. What do you expect me to do, sleep alone?"
Taylor's scandalous romance ignited a media firestorm. Protesters picketed the couple at Fisher's concerts.
Elizabeth suddenly found herself changing from being the widow whom everyone had sympathy for to being the marriage breaker whom everyone reviled.
In 1959, the 27-year-old mother of three defied public opinion and took her fourth walk down the aisle. As a sign of devotion to Eddie Fisher, she also converted to Judaism. Hollywood was hungry to cash in on Elizabeth's new image in the press as an irresistible, raven-haired seductress. Taylor received $500,000 and her third Oscar nomination for Suddenly Last Summer, a adaptation of a Tennessee Williams play. MGM shrewdly sold the film with an image of its gorgeous star in a bathing suit.
It was a one-piece bathing suit made of something white. The water made it transparent. I told him I didn't want to swim in it, but he just grabbed me by the hand and dragged me into the water all the way, and I came out looking nude.
For movie audiences, Taylor's image as a confident seductress even eclipsed the vulnerable sexuality of Marilyn Monroe at the box office. And Taylor took her status as Hollywood's hottest actress all the way to the bank.
The phone rang and it was Walter Wanger asking her if she'd like to play Cleopatra.
Well, I was in the bathtub. Eddie answered the phone, and I was getting so sick of it, I really didn't want to. It was terrible. And I said, "Yeah, tell him I'll do it for $1 million and 10% of the absolute gross," which was absurd, and I meant it to be absurd. And Eddie came back and said through the door, he said, "Okay, it's a deal." I just screamed and dove under the water, inhaling more water because I was laughing so hard.
The Motion Picture Casting Achievement of the Year is about to become a recorded fact as producer Walter Wanger introduces Elizabeth Taylor to 20th Century Fox executive producer Buddy Adler.
The first actress to break the $1 million barrier, Taylor was about to stand center stage in a real-life drama that would brand Elizabeth as the world's most infamous woman.
What a role! And Liz is the gal to do it justice.
Before Elizabeth Taylor could start, the 27-year-old had one last film to make at MGM. It would complete her contract with the studio that held her creatively captive for 18 years.
Working for MGM, it was just pure slavery. If you turned down a script, they put you on suspension. It was slavery.
MGM was eager to exploit Elizabeth's scandalous image by casting her in Butterfield 8, the racy tale of a doomed prostitute. But Taylor refused.
She thought the part of Gloria Wanderess, a call girl in the film, was no better than a whore, a prostitute. And indeed, that's what the part was.
You're all alike, aren't you? Play tough.
I'm not like anyone, I'm me.
When MGM's brass cast Eddie Fisher in a small role, Elizabeth grudgingly agreed to do the movie.
Because I'm sick of opening that door every other day and finding you boozed up, burned out, and ugly. Why do you come here like this?
Where have I always come, Steve? At least I can be honest with you.
But during the tense production, Taylor grew impatient, both with MGM and her husband, as she realized that the man she married was no Mike Todd.
She began to appreciate Eddie's shortcomings, which were not certainly those of the ebullient and radiant life that she had led with Mike Todd.
With her MGM contract finally behind her, Elizabeth jetted that September to England's Pinewood Studios. There she began filming Cleopatra, opposite co-stars Peter Finch and Stephen Boyd. But from the start, the epic production seemed cursed due to cost overages and endless rainstorms.
How can you make England in the winter look like the Mediterranean?
The chilly English climate also took a toll on Elizabeth's increasingly fragile health. For years, she had battled bronchial problems and complications from her teenage spinal injury. On the set of Cleopatra, she was on the point of a physical breakdown.
She was carried to the set. She was so ill. She'd do a few costume tests and then be carried back. And she was always, always sick during this time.
Elizabeth's energy was fading. And that March, Taylor collapsed at her hotel. She was in a coma and near death.
The Queen's doctor came screaming in the room and picked me up by the feet and shook me like a rag doll. He pounded my ribs. Nothing.
It was even reported in papers that she had died. She was given an hour to live.
For days, Elizabeth hovered between life and death. Surgeons cut open her throat to perform an emergency tracheotomy. The world that had denounced her as a homewrecker now watched and prayed for her survival.
Churches began to pray for Elizabeth Taylor. Classes in schools were assembled. Prayers were offered for Elizabeth Taylor's survival.
Taylor's courageous battle for life shamed and silenced even her harshest critics. And there was genuine rejoicing as Elizabeth slowly recovered.
There's my tracheotomy. I'm very proud of that.
Back in the United States after her brush with death in London, Elizabeth Taylor is carried from her plane in a wheelchair. She takes the excitement like the true trooper she is, though she's still weak from her bout with an exceptionally virulent form of pneumonia. And now, representing a triumph for the will to live, she's off to California for a long rest in which fully to recuperate.
Public sympathy also helped make Butterfield 8 a box office hit.
The envelope, please. Elizabeth Taylor.
And in 1961, the film earned the actress her first Academy Award for a movie she loathed.
I don't really know how to express my gratitude for this and for everything. I guess all I can do is say thank you. Thank you with all my heart.
I think she said she got it for her tracheotomy. Hated the movie, hated her part, said so. Piece of crap movie, but thank you.
4-5.
All right, camera.
7 months after her collapse, Taylor returned to Cleopatra. Production had moved from London to Rome, where it was hoped the warm climate might help the fragile star recover. Oscar-winning director Joseph L. Mankiewicz was now in charge of the project, and there were also cast changes. Rex Harrison signed on as Julius Caesar, and playing Mark Antony was a 37-year-old Welshman named Richard Burton. An acclaimed stage and screen performer, Burton was viewed by many as the heir apparent to Laurence Olivier. But the actor, married to actress Sybil Williams, was just as infamous for his heavy drinking and flagrant affairs.
I had met him before, and he'd flirted like mad with me. And I said, I'm not going to be another notch on his belt. Little did I know.
You will kneel.
I will what?
On your knees.
Dare ask the proconsul of the Roman Empire?
I asked it of Julius Caesar. I demand it of you.
But on the set of Cleopatra, Taylor saw another side of her complex co-star.
Burton arrived absolutely brutally hungover, and Elizabeth had to help him raise a cup of coffee to his lips. It brought out the mother in her. She found it endearing that here was this titanic actor, intellectual, a needy child.
The thing that brought them together was the ribald humor that Richard Burton had. Dirty jokes that he could tell, which vastly engaged Elizabeth's sense of humor, because there was that side to her too.
For Taylor, Burton was a challenge and an irresistible temptation.
Are you quite sure what it is you want? So desperately?
I've always been sure.
Within weeks, the pair had transferred their dangerous passion from cinematic make-believe into reality.
I want to be free of you, of wanting you, of being afraid.
That Caesar would not permit it.
And Elizabeth was in the makeup department. And no sooner did I sit in the makeup chair, and Richard came in, gave her a big old smooch, and sat in the chair next to me, and I saw all of this in the mirror, and I said, oh my God.
Beginning with tonight, you must never envy Caesar or anyone, anything again.
One of their first love scenes, it ended and Joe Mankiewicz said, cut. And he said, cut. And then he finally had to go, cut. You know, everybody knew by then what was going on.
News of the affair quickly swept the globe, and Taylor's image transformed yet again, from heroic survivor to immoral adulteress.
Taylor and Burton were the two most famous people in the world. Several congressmen wanted to take away her passport. The Pope actually verbally denounced their romance.
The Vatican got into the act, saying that she was a bad influence on the world in general and that her children should be taken away from her.
As critics attacked the couple, paparazzi jostled to snap pictures that were worth a fortune.
This was the first tabloid film. Cleopatra had more headlines than the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Hey!
But perhaps no day of filming was more dramatic or rewarding for Elizabeth than Cleopatra's triumphant entry into Rome.
Right before she's supposed to be in the midst of 7,000 Italian, presumably Catholic, extras, the Vatican, they wanted her booed and hissed. She was terrified. The studio was terrified. They posted armed guards around the forum set so that she could be protected from assassination. She got on top of this 30-foot sphinx, was drawn through the arch, and instead of yelling Cleopatra, Cleopatra like they were supposed to, they went wild and screamed, Liz! Liz! And just in this wave of love, demonstrated their support for her. That's when the sexual revolution of the 60s was truly born. Liz had conquered the Pope.
As for Taylor's husband, the humiliated Eddie Fisher saw the writing on the wall.
Dad advised Eddie to go back to New York. He said, Eddie's really out of his league here with this romance. I mean, these two people will eat him alive. They're so in love with each other.
2 years had passed since Cleopatra began production, and throughout 1962, filming continued to spiral out of control.
Waste was tremendous, just simply tremendous. Everywhere you looked was waste.
Do you know they had down $3 million miscellaneous, $5 million unaccountable?
As costs climbed past $40 million, the future of Fox was now at stake. After 3 years, 2 directors, $44 million, and the world's most publicized love affair, Cleopatra finally premiered on June 12, 1963. Critics called it everything from surpassing entertainment to a monumental mouse.
Elizabeth, she said the final humiliation was having to go and see it. But she went, she came out of there, rushed to the ladies' room and threw up.
They just made it into a parade of costume changes. It had such potential of being a classy film.
Despite mixed reviews, audiences flocked to Cleopatra. And although the film took years to show a profit, 31-year-old Elizabeth's final paycheck was a jaw-dropping $7 million, thanks to the many schedule overruns. More importantly, Taylor had also won Richard Burton, a man whose reckless extremes would push Elizabeth to an outrageous new peak of celebrity.
Does a film star ever become accustomed to being asked very personal questions?
No. Would you?
Do you resent them?
Sometimes, if they're too personal, I find it an affront on my privacy.
By 1963, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were everywhere. From theaters showing their second film together, The VIPs, to front pages that flashed their latest exploits.
The public was ready for the 60s revolution, and Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton just symbolized adulterous love that was celebrated.
Taylor felt no regret as she divorced Eddie Fisher, although Burton agonized for months before leaving his wife of 15 years. In 1964, at age 32, Elizabeth wed for the 5th time. She swore it would be the last.
Liz says she's never been happier in her life than with you.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
It'll last a while.
A while?
Yeah.
Watch it.
Taylor hoped the media frenzy would fade after she married Burton, but it only grew as Richard showered his bride with expensive gifts and jewelry amid lovers' quarrels played out in public.
I think having a fight, an out-and-out, outrageous, ridiculous fight, is one of the greatest exercises in marital togetherness. I think
especially if you have no really weak points. You see, you do not attack the weak points. And when she attacks me, double chins.
You bloody well have.
Yeah, she's got a slightly fat belly. I never use
Well, I've got
those
his
things.
pockmarks, you know.
He had the temerity to humiliate the most beautiful woman in the world, just as Mike did. And her sense of humor sometimes got so bawdy that she thought that was funny.
Elizabeth and Richard combined not only their careers, but their families. Besides her 2 sons with Michael Wilding and her daughter with Mike Todd, Elizabeth had adopted a young girl from Germany named Maria. Taylor was also a loving parent to Burton's 2 children.
But she was such a force of loving nature and caring and nurturing that that is really true about her. She really knows how to be a mother who lets the children grow up.
Taylor also remained one of the world's hottest movie stars, teaming with Burton in such films as Dr. Faustus, The Comedians, and the glossy romance, The Sandpiper.
Elizabeth Taylor, I, Richard Burton, will take nothing from the Big Sur and will leave no scars. And only a film will exist to show that intruders from the commercial world had come, however briefly, to the Big Sur.
The movies gave viewers the chance to watch their passionate relationship on the big screen. But no film was more riveting than Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Directed by Mike Nichols, the 1966 drama was based on Edward Albee's searing play about a university couple embroiled in marital warfare.
Fix me another drink, lover.
My God, you can sweat it down, can't you?
Well, I'm thirsty.
Oh, Jesus.
Look, sweetheart, I can drink you under any goddamn table you want, so don't worry about me.
I gave everything I had to give. I wore prosthetics and padding, put on 20 pounds. I was 33 and playing a drunk, ravenous 55-year-old woman who was deep but didn't know how to express it.
And I'm not gonna give a damn what I do, and I'm gonna make the biggest goddamn explosion you've ever heard.
You try it, and I'll beat you at your own game.
Is that a threat, George, huh?
That's a threat, Martha.
You're gonna get it, baby.
Be careful, Martha. I'll rip you to pieces.
You're not man enough. You haven't the guts.
I think that was my favorite role because I really had to get my finger out and act.
Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was a critical and commercial triumph. Both Elizabeth and Richard earned Oscar nominations. And although Burton lost to Paul Scofield in A Man for All Seasons, Taylor was thrilled to accept her second Best Actress trophy, this time for a role she was truly proud of. Elizabeth now felt bold enough to tackle the ultimate actor's challenge, Shakespeare, in Franco Zeffirelli's production of The Taming of the Shrew.
That was shattering because I'd never done Shakespeare before. And here's Muggins from Hollywood, you know, who had done Cleopatra, which was like a mockery to those people.
I said, Richard, I'm scared witless. I know nothing about it. You've got to help me, because I'm absolutely panic-struck. He said, listen, Mabel, you did all right in Virginia Wolf. You did all right in Quack, Quack, Quack. Just consider it exactly the same, and you do it on your own. And if it isn't your own, then it won't mean anything.
Elizabeth brought a complete freshness and her own personality. Katharina the Shrew is a pretty lively lady, and as was Elizabeth, you know, very beautiful and with quite a mouth on her.
There was only one line she asked me about actually in the entire play, and she had most of the lines. She said, how the hell does one say, whom dost thou lovest best?
Without sounding like a toffee in your mouth.
But by the late 1960s, no movie was more opulent or outrageous than Taylor and Burton's lifestyle.
I think ever since I was released from MGM, my penal servitude, and was on my own and making my own deals, that I really started having fun.
Taylor and Burton spent millions on fur coats, a yacht, Rolls Royces, even a $900,000 jet. And then, of course, there was the jewelry.
The Krupp diamond, the La Pellegrina pearl, huge rings. It was almost pathological the way he went after every famous jewel in the world that came on the market to buy for Elizabeth. He saw it, I think, as a way of atoning for the sin of leaving his own wife. She saw it as evidence of the strength of love that he had for her.
Swept up in the media madness, Elizabeth and Richard seemed addicted to their spending and their fame. They were facing other addictions as well. Burton was tortured by guilt over leaving Sybil and by his contempt for the celebrity that he also craved. By 1968, he was drinking more heavily than ever, and so was his 36-year-old wife, despite her precarious health.
Richard really had an alcoholic problem, and it fed into some weaknesses she had in that area.
Elizabeth mirrored her husband's self-destructiveness. Her drinking increased, her weight fluctuated, and she was sluggish after daily injections of painkillers for her back. Meanwhile, her films, like Secret Ceremony and Boom, were failing at the box office, overshadowed by movies from more innovative filmmakers.
The kind of films that Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty and Hoffman and Pacino starred in were really offbeat films and new kinds of films, much more sexually explicit, with far more violence in them. The Burtons were beginning to feel a back number.
For 38-year-old Elizabeth, the 1970s began with a thud, with the release of the romantic comedy The Only Game in Town, co-starring Warren Beatty.
You always make jokes.
Only when I'm nervous.
What are you nervous about?
I don't know how to get you from here to the bedroom.
That is the lousiest approach I have ever heard.
The movie was an expensive flop, and its failure foreshadowed Elizabeth's next 3 years, a time of failed films and bitter fights with Richard, who was caught having an affair with a co-star.
Like a tigress, she was fighting for her marriage still. He could insult her in front of the crew, and she never cared. She would have given anything for that marriage to have worked.
After co-starring with Richard in the TV movie Divorce His, Divorce Hers, the exhausted actress finally gave up. In 1974, Elizabeth was granted a divorce from her husband of a decade. It was a move she soon regretted, and within months the pair briefly reconciled.
A new marriage ceremony took place rather exotically on a game reserve in South Africa, almost like a ceremony of innocence in which they pledged their truth to each other, like flower children.
But Act 2 of the Taylor-Burton show had a short and unpleasant run. Richard remained an abusive alcoholic. Each took up with other lovers. And in 1976, after 15 years of romance, anger, and passion, Elizabeth and Richard separated for the final time.
I think it was one of the great love affairs between two remarkable individuals, both extraordinarily glamorous and genuine. It was the real thing.
Elizabeth's second divorce from Richard Burton sent the actress reeling. She was now 44, and for the first time in her life, she was facing the future alone. Elizabeth Taylor found distraction from her second divorce from Richard Burton with a trip to Washington, D.C. The occasion was the 1976 celebration of America's bicentennial. While there, she met a handsome political insider named John Warner.
If Central Casting had sent along a distinguished American, almost as handsome as a film star, to play opposite Elizabeth Taylor, it would have been John Warner.
The former Secretary of the Navy was divorced and politically ambitious, with an eye on a Republican Senate seat. After years of high melodrama with Richard Burton, Elizabeth considered the 49-year-old gentleman farmer a pleasing change of pace.
He had horses on his farm in Virginia, and you know how she feels about horses.
I wanted to grow old with somebody on the farm and sit in front of the fireplace and read books.
6 months later, after a whirlwind courtship, Elizabeth embarked on her 7th marriage. Taylor was happy to put chaos and her acting career behind her for a calmer life in Virginia. In 1978, she assumed a new role as candidate's wife, actively supporting Warner's campaign for the U.S. Senate.
And we look forward to the next 8 or 9 months.
May I say something?
I beg your
My
pardon.
husband, my husband is the candidate. I'm not. I'm the candidate's wife, and that's the role I plan on keeping. So I'm going back to my...
Let me finish.
With Taylor's help, Warner won the election, but the patrician corridors of power offered little welcome for the film star. And even her husband grew distant as he buried himself in his work.
When politics came along, it was like the Senate became his wife. And I couldn't cope with that.
Elizabeth soon felt isolated and alone in the Virginia farmhouse that she called domestic Siberia.
She was unhappy, so she ate herself into a blimp. And, I mean, who wouldn't being married to a politician?
The world's most beautiful woman was now the target of comedians' potshots and gossip. Fans were shocked by her tremendous weight gain.
I knew I was plunging, and that the ultimate result would be death, and that I had to do something drastic to pull myself out of it. And I was drinking so much. So I thought, what is the most challenging thing I can think of doing? And I thought, Broadway.
In 1981, the 49-year-old agreed to star in a Broadway revival of Lillian Hellman's drama, The Little Foxes. Taylor undertook a radical diet and exercise program, and by opening night, she had recaptured her classic beauty. The show was a sellout, but triumph was once again overshadowed by loss. That December, after 5 years with John Warner, Elizabeth ended another unhappy marriage. Returning to Los Angeles, Elizabeth made headlines again when she was publicly linked with daytime drama heartthrob Anthony Geary.
God! It's Elizabeth Taylor!
In 1981, she even made a cameo appearance on Geary's hit daytime soap opera, General Hospital.
That's my second home, is a hospital. So just the thought of it, I thought, was so camp, doing General Hospital.
My curse on you, Laura and Luke. My curse on both of you.
That was a giggle.
I have seen General Hospital and the university, and I approve. As my husband would have approved. Mikos Casa. I'm sorry.
She wasn't at all the standoffish, violet-eyed star. She was very much a colleague.
Mikos Cassadine had a deep and abiding love. I said Cassadine.
That's right. That's right.
Oh,
Right,
I startled myself. I'm sorry. sorry, folks. I'm not used to acting.
The best part of spending time with Elizabeth was her humor and how hungry she was to experience regular, quote, regular life. She had been a star since she was 10 or something, and I remember one time she wanted to go play pinball machines on Santa Monica Pier because she'd never played one. It was kind of sad to me to realize that something as simple and as kind of silly as that was not available to her.
But despite her return to acting and to life in California, Elizabeth was physically exhausted by chronic health problems, public responsibilities, and a grueling schedule. Once again, her life was approaching a crisis point. In 1983, Elizabeth Taylor delighted fans and the press by announcing that she and Richard Burton were back together. But this time, the reunion was strictly professional, as the pair agreed to co-star in the classic stage comedy Private Lives.
You're the most thrilling, exciting that was ever born.
Dearest. Dearest heart.
Oh my God.
Noel Coward's play about bickering lovers should have been perfect for the pair. But the 58-year-old Burton appeared haggard and weak, while Taylor was turning once again to alcohol and prescription drugs. Reviews were brutal, and by the end of an exhausting 7-month stage tour, Elizabeth was approaching an emotional and physical breakdown. It was up to her family and closest friends to step in and save her.
She was ambushed one day, discovered that she was almost being put on trial by this living room filled by her nearest and dearest, her children, who told her mother, "You've got to take yourself in hand."
Elizabeth was shocked, but she also listened. And that December, the 51-year-old screen legend checked into the Betty Ford Clinic in Rancho Mirage, California. Her decision made instant headlines.
I'm proud that I did it. And I hope that other women would think, well, if she can do it, I can do it.
At the clinic, Taylor shared a bedroom and waited her turn for the bathroom. She emptied trash cans and swept her living space. But the tough program had an impact. Taylor used the time to examine her life, her addictions, and her choices. That August, Elizabeth's hard-won sobriety was put to the test when she was told that Richard Burton had died of a massive hemorrhage.
He'll never leave me. In a way, I don't think our relationship ever ended. 2 months before he died, he said to his brother, "Oh, that bloody woman. I still love her, and I know one day I'm gonna end up marrying her again." We couldn't stay away from each other.
Months later, Elizabeth received more devastating news. Her good friend, Rock Hudson, was dying of a mysterious illness called AIDS. Taylor was furious that little was being done to stop a disease that some were calling God's punishment of the gay community.
AIDS knows no prejudice. It strikes men, women, children, and we must strike back. And with your help, we will, and we will win. Thank you.
His death activated her into some kind of a movement, which then became a cause.
Many of us have lost a dear friend to AIDS. Don't wait until someone you care for is touched by this horrifying illness.
I went to a hospice outside Rome. It was all AIDS patients. And the society ladies of Rome couldn't walk their dogs near this building because they thought AIDS was airborne and that their dogs might catch it or they might catch it. The ignorance. And I went inside and I said, "Is there anything we can do for you? And one man said, to have someone put their arms around us. I could feel the tears stinging my eyes. And I kissed each and every one of them.
Elizabeth became a warrior in the dawning battle against AIDS. In 1987, the 55-year-old founded AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research. It has raised over $64 million and continues to raise millions around the world. The actress also created the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, and she has continued to cover all of its operating expenses. Every dollar of the millions raised has gone to provide services to AIDS victims and give preventative education to the public.
A lot of people closed doors on her, but she fought and fought and fought and raised hundreds of millions of dollars for AIDS over the years.
Acting is absolutely unimportant in my life. My life is totally AIDS. And I will do anything I can to help.
Throughout the 1980s, Elizabeth balanced her overriding cause of AIDS fundraising with occasional acting roles in TV and film. She also launched a business.
Passion, I see, is catching.
After the success of her first perfume, Passion, Elizabeth Taylor's White Diamonds also became one of the top-selling fragrances in America. It remains one of the most popular scents in the country. The actress also made headlines with a string of high-profile beaus, including George Hamilton and millionaire Malcolm Forbes. But Taylor still fought agonizing health problems and took pills to fight excruciating pain in her spine. The 56-year-old was slipping back into dependency on prescription drugs. Taylor returned to the Betty Ford Clinic. She emerged not only healthier, but with a new boyfriend. Larry Fortensky was a 35-year-old construction worker who had gone to the clinic to fight his own battle with alcohol.
He'd already been married twice. He was a handsome guy, a handsome hunk. But he had no interests that were in common with Elizabeth, except that they both had the common interest of getting off the bottle.
Here he's squiring on Elizabeth Taylor, and I think he felt like he was run over by a truck, because everybody came to see Elizabeth and how are you, dear, and we all love her and everything else, and he was just there.
But Elizabeth and Larry stayed together, and in 1991, the 59-year-old spoke familiar wedding vows for the 8th time.
The wedding to Larry Fortensky was at Michael Jackson's ranch. It was quite a media circus, that's for sure. During the ceremony, you couldn't even hear anything because the helicopters were flying just above, which was a nightmare. And then some guy jumped out of a helicopter in a parachute and landed in the middle of, right where the ceremony was. But at the end of it, it was a beautiful wedding.
In 1992, Elizabeth celebrated not only her 60th birthday, but her restored health and her new marriage with an all-night party at Disneyland.
I'm 60 years old today, but I'm dedicating this celebration of life to the kid in me.
Taylor was having fun, and her sense of playfulness came through in a cartoon cameo on the hip TV hit The Simpsons.
I've got to fire that agent.
A year later, Taylor returned to the big screen, playing Fred Flintstone's shrewish mother-in-law in The Flintstones. But the pendulum extremes that marked Elizabeth's life were about to swing again. At age 62, she was forced to undergo surgery for hip replacement. After a series of painful complications, Taylor's health continued to deteriorate, and so did her 3-year marriage.
Larry was behaving in a way that she felt slightly brutish and thuggish. She used to send him out on expeditions, partly to get rid of him, and he would put up shelves for the neighbors. Since the neighbors happened to be ex-President Ronald Reagan and Nancy, it was a rather privileged piece of shelf fixing that Larry went about.
Few were surprised when in 1996, the 64-year-old Elizabeth and Larry Fortensky divorced after nearly 5 years of marriage. The actress was philosophical. Deaths illnesses, destructive addictions, broken marriages, all things considered, she told the press, I'm damn lucky to be alive. In 1997, Elizabeth Taylor turned 65 years old, but it would not be a year of celebration. After suffering agonizing headaches, the actress was diagnosed with a brain tumor. It was the most frightening crisis Elizabeth had faced in decades. Friends watched and waited as doctors shaved Taylor's beautiful hair and removed a 2-inch tumor from her brain. To her relief, the tumor was benign, and Taylor embarked on a slow, painful recovery, which was also tested when her lifelong friend, Roddy McDowell, lost his battle with cancer.
He became my best friend. And of course, we had so much in common.
She once said to me, why is it that all the good people die and I just keep going on and on and on? And I said, obviously it's because you have something you have to do. And she's more than proven that that's true.
Elizabeth's commitment to life powered her through a remarkable recovery.
Oh, I've been pronounced dead. I've read my own obituaries, and they were the best reviews I've ever read.
In 2000, the actress traveled to her birthplace, England, where she was made a Dame of the British Empire. It was an honor bestowed by another famous Elizabeth. Taylor called it the most exciting day of her life. Dame Elizabeth also returned to acting. The project was the TV movie These Old Broads, written by her former stepdaughter, Carrie Fisher. Playing a show business manager, Elizabeth camped it up alongside Joan Collins, Shirley MacLaine, and even Debbie Reynolds, Taylor's old rival for the heart of Eddie Fisher.
They both knew that everybody was interested in who they were and what it was going to be like, so they were performing a little bit.
This isn't about the costume. It's about Freddie, isn't it?
Freddie Hunter? Oh, please. I haven't thought about him in ages.
Because if it is, I wanted to remind you it all happened so long ago when we were so young.
Well, let's just drop it, okay? I forgave you years ago. So let's move on.
Okay.
Great.
Good?
Grand.
Gravy!
She and Debbie had talks about the past, about what went on. When women get together and are honest and open about their feelings, it leaves the men in the dust.
I don't want to worry about you around my husband, Bill.
Please, I spend most of my time in bed.
Well, from what I understand, you can do quite a lot of damage in bed.
In 2002, Elizabeth also published a history of her fabled jewelry collection, a book that was her most personal memoir to date. Elizabeth Taylor, My Love Affair with Jewelry, detailed the history of her most precious gems, ranging from the first piece Taylor ever bought, a gift for her mother, to the famous jewels given to her by Richard Burton. The book's proceeds went to Elizabeth's AIDS Foundation and was an instant success. At a time when most of her peers settled into retirement, Taylor remained a vital and hands-on force in the perfume business. Now the chairman of her own company, House of Taylor, she oversaw the successful release of the 2002 fragrance Forever Elizabeth and its follow-up, Gardenia.
She has never felt that she reached an end point in her life. She said to me once, you know, the only thing I really fear is living as long as my mother. Her mother didn't die until she was 99. And at times, despite all her ill health, Elizabeth must think that she's going on forever.
I want to enjoy things and have fun and live like every day is the last day.
Like the diamonds she has collected, Elizabeth Taylor remains the embodiment of beauty and strength. And after decades of tragedy and controversy, she continues to shine in her ultimate role of survivor.
And I'm not gonna give a damn what I do, and I'm gonna make the biggest goddamn explosion you've ever heard.
I admire Elizabeth most for her empathy, for her loyalty, for her seemingly endless desire to champion causes or people. That's an extraordinary quality.
She's a genuine person. That humor and intelligence is constant. And she's got a smile and a laugh and a generous spirit no matter what's going on.
Besides, you love me very much.
We all love her. And she hasn't changed from the time she was a 15-year-old girl in my mind.
I think we all have lived our lives through her. Every time she got a divorce, we thought about the divorce we were engaged in. Every time she fell in love, we felt the same way.
I feel very lucky. Sometimes I think my heart will crack, but all in all, I consider myself the luckiest woman in the world.
In May of 2003, 61 years after she first dazzled audiences as a child star, Elizabeth Taylor announced her retirement from acting. The news confirmed the fact that her last years had been challenging, as the actress had been beset by a series of serious health issues. Most significantly, she was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in 2004, but she also battled back pain, a brain tumor, osteoporosis, and in late 2009, a problematic heart valve. And though her career and mobility were compromised by mounting, her spirit remained undiminished. She focused her formidable talents on being one of the most vocal supporters and fundraisers for AIDS awareness and research.
People with AIDS are living longer. People with AIDS are living healthier. But sadly, people with AIDS are still not living forever.
While her professional life was marked by notable success, the two-time Academy Award winner's personal life was less consistent. Over the years, she had a number of highly publicized love affairs, but also suffered through both heartbreak and tragedy, often in full public view. And indeed, tragedy struck again for Miss Taylor in 2009, when her good friend Michael Jackson died unexpectedly. From the ingenue in National Velvet, to the fatally beautiful Cleopatra, to the vicious matrimonial combatant in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Elizabeth Taylor has given filmgoers some of the most memorable moments in screen history. A timeless beauty, an iconic actress, a relentless champion in the fight against AIDS. Elizabeth Taylor, forever one of Hollywood's greatest stars.